Hi, welcome to the CIDCI Online Salon Series. I'm Margie O'Driscoll, and on behalf of the CIDCI Board of Directors, I'd like to welcome you here today. CIDCI's mission is to accelerate change in the built environment by convening innovators for educational programs. We also serve as a trusted source of information about innovation. Special thanks to all of our sponsors who make this possible. CIDCI is a nonprofit organization that relies on your financial support to provide these programs. Many of you have received a renewal invoice to continue your support this year. Please respond as generously as you can. For some Americans in our audience, this may be your first work-related event of the day. We are all still reeling from the horrifying events in our nation's capital yesterday. Not since the War of 1812, when British forces set fire to the Capitol, have the halls of our nation's power been overtaken by violent intruders. No matter what your political affiliation might be, we know that the heart of American democracy is stronger than the violence we saw yesterday. Now, more than ever, please mask up, wash your hands, stay home, and be kind. Take care of yourself and those around you, and believe in American democracy. Okay, here's a little bit of information about how today's session will work. We're recording this presentation and we'll place it on the CIDCI website as soon as possible. If you have questions or comments during the presentation, please use the chat box. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. Today's session is scheduled to run for 90 minutes due to the amount of content that we have for you. Today's presentation is entitled Rise of the Platform Era, the Next Chapter in Construction Technology, and features two amazing presenters. The first is Josh Johnston from McKinsey and Company, and he'll be in conversation with Jaimie Johnston from Bryden, who you heard last year. Josh Johnston is an expert in McKinsey and Company's engineering, construction, and building materials practice in Philadelphia, where he serves construction industry clients on issues at the intersection of operations and technology. In addition to his client-facing work, Josh is an active member of the McKinsey Black Network, and when he's not helping clients build cool stuff, he spends time with either an electric guitar or one of his two kids draped around his neck. Jaimie Johnston is the Director of Global Systems for Bryden, UK. Jaimie is responsible for the application of systems to the delivery and operation of truly high-performing assets. This includes both physical DFMA systems and information systems like data analysis, digital delivery, and BIM for projects in the UK, Europe, and Asia with clients including GlaxoSmithKline, Heathrow Airport, and a number of government departments. Jaimie is one of the UK's leading thinkers on the future of industrialized construction. Josh will start us off on some of his research with colleagues at McKinsey. Jaimie's going to stop in different parts and ask him questions. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll open it up to all of you for your questions and comments. Thank you. And Josh, we're so glad to have you.
Thank you so much. I will just say that it is truly a pleasure and an honor to be able to, present and share knowledge with, just an amazing group of people. And so for those who are on, again, my name is Josh Johnston. I'm an expert in the engineering, construction, and building materials practice. And the content that I'll be sharing today is based primarily on two perspectives that we published last year. The first being The Next Normal in Construction, which was published in June, and the second being Rise of the Platform Era, the Next Chapter in Construction Technology, which was published in October. Both of these perspectives are available for free on our website, www.mckinsey.com. You just search for the name of the publication, and you can download it for free and read it to your heart's content. So, as we kick off, let's set the stage and understand a bit about how we view the construction industry, because construction technology, as awesome and as sexy as it can be, is still kind of an enabling industry to the overall construction industry. So when we think about construction, construction is big. And I think that it's worth a sobering reminder of just how big construction is. The 2019 spend for construction accounted to something around $13 trillion globally. And if you put that into perspective, $13 trillion as a nation state would make construction land right? The third largest economy in the world behind the US and China. It would only be fourth if you take the aggregate, output of the European Union. So the construction industry, the construction ecosystem is absolutely massive and critically important to the global economy. So kind of moving along with this analogy of construction land, what does construction land look like? Well, there are lagging productivity growth in construction land. Many of the businesses in construction land, from a productivity standpoint, operate either at or less productive than they did several years ago. On aggregate, there is slow innovation and digitization. It's one of the least digitized countries, if we're going with the nation state example, compared to any other, industry, be it tech or other hard manufacturing, be it auto, aerospace, electronics. The amount of technology adoption is quite low. Profits on an global industry level are also quite low. The average profit pool is only 4 to 5%, and you have low customer satisfaction. And that's driven primarily by evidence of, common budget and schedule overruns, particularly for projects that get into the, several $100 million to $1 billion range. And what drives that, right? You have a project-based building approach across all players in the ecosystem. The ecosystem itself is highly fragmented and hyper-regional. There are misaligned contractual structures and incentives throughout the value chain, and use of contractors and temporary staff often contributes to these knowledge silos where you have one subcontractor or one engineering outfit that has the capability and knowledge to complete a job, and they're able to craft out a specific defensible position in a hyper localized geography. And so, the crib notes for the next normal, where do we think the industry is going? Well, we think, based on a few factors, that there's going to be a significant amount of value chain consolidation and integration. What does that mean? That means there's going to be fewer layers, i.e., fewer intermediary steps, and fewer competitors within each of those steps. We think that there's going to be a big push towards productization and industrialization of construction projects. So industrialization, meaning moving from, in the US, we call it stick build, right? Individual crews of workers bringing materials to site, working in situ to build something in place, to more either offsite prefabricated manufacturing, industrialized manufacturing, like advanced applications of lean on site, robotics introduced to site in a much higher level, and then productization. If you look at the construction industry and look at the analogy of the airline industry or the car industry, both of those aforementioned industries used to have several individual and independent manufacturers that essentially operated as job shops, as many general contractors do now. But those industries both experienced significant degrees of consolidation and integration, to the point where you have cars as products, airplanes as products. It's a Boeing or an Airbus versus a bespoke airplane. In the same way, we would expect that moving forward 15, 20 years from now, the construction industry is going to have insert contractor, insert producer type of buildings. These are Josh's residential buildings. These are Jaimie's commercial towers, and developers will be purchasing products just as much as they are fielding projects. And on aggregate, we believe that this is going to put about 40 to 45% of the value in the value chain at stake in the most affected segments. So what do we think is going to be the way to, weather some of these kind of disruptions? Well, a lot of this looks like motherhood and apple pie, right? Like you hear industry participants talk about these things ad nauseum, but what we're really pushing at here is these things need to not just happen, but they need to happen in a step change in a quite short order amount of time, right? Projects need to be delivered in less time and at lower cost, and not incrementally, but a significant step change. We need to deliver safe outcomes with much more predictable and consistent risk profiles. That would require us to reimagine both internal and external collaboration, and make sure that our projects and our execution are repeatable, continual, improving, and sustainable. And then finally, we need to maximize end-to-end value for all stakeholders. When you often look at technology, specifically construction technology, most construction technology firms are highly focused on serving general contractors, architects, engineers, players within the construction sphere. And when we look at where the value is generated and won or lost in the life cycle of a construction project, it's actually won or lost. Most of the money is spent over the lifetime of a project in, it's established in the engineering and design phase up front, where you're speccing things out and you're either going to spec something that's extremely expensive or not. And it's also done in the operations and maintenance phase, where the long tail of spend happens. But at least in terms of technology, the overwhelming volume of players are in the construction and commissioning phase as it relates to construction technology. So that maximization of end-to-end value for all stakeholders, not just the contractors and engineers, also needs to happen. So when we earlier in 2020, we conducted a survey as a part of our research on the new normal, and asked a significant amount of industry participants, what do you think is going to happen with the industry? How do you think the value chain is going to change, and who in the value chain is going to require the most change to adapt to these shifts? And this was about 400 leaders globally, and the names that popped out earliest were general contractors, developers, design engineering firms, and specialist contractors, i.e., the players executing or designing the work, right? When asked which type of player do you think is going to see the largest decline in 10 years or even stop existing, those same players floated to the list. The only players that had any kind of analogous jump in the second question were material distributors. And in my estimation, that just points to this trend of productization and industrialization. Because in the current paradigm, you have hundreds, if not thousands, of very small to intermediate size individual contributors across any geography that you can pick, and they don't have the scale to produce or procure at the rates where they can go direct to an OEM, building materials manufacturer. They have to go to some type of distribution network. Well, if you have some type of significant consolidation where you have many more integrated players, suddenly those distributors are no longer as critical. You have fewer players who are much larger, who can go directly to the source. So when we think about the construction industry, it's also important to think about how the pandemic has impacted the industry. And this data is relevant or is updated. It's all relevant, but it's updated as of September of last year. So it's not as recent as December or this month. But the fact of the matter is, the construction industry was hammered by the COVID pandemic. This is US specific data. And as of September of last year, starts for structures was down around 40% year over year. When we look at how industry leaders were looking at the pandemic, particularly as it relates to technology, the interesting thing here is, those leaders were expecting shifts to begin with, and really just believe that the pandemic accelerated existing shifts. So 90% of respondents to our surveys believed that the industry needed to change now. That change was more acute than it was 5 years ago. And then 80% of them believe that the industry was going to change and look radically different in 20 years. And how will that look radically different? Well, when we looked at several shifts, we asked our respondents, which do you believe is going to accelerate, stay the same, or slow down as a result of the COVID-19 crisis? And nearly 70% of those respondents believe that crisis is going to accelerate investment in technology and facilities. Interestingly, to this point around, again, industrialization, productization, when you look at these respondents, and the only other responses that have similar rates of response are on value chain control and integration with industrial grade supply chains, and consolidation. Again, fewer spans, fewer layers, and a much more integrated value chain and supply chain. So finally, let's, at least in this portion of the talk, let's talk about technology as a change agent, right? So, as a part of our ongoing research, we published a report, I believe it was back in 2017, called Reinventing Construction, A Route to Higher Productivity. And in that report, we looked at several best practice levers to improve productivity in construction. And lo and behold, the most impactful individual lever was technology. Not saying that any of these other levers were not important, they absolutely are. But if we're able to unlock, technology and the efficiencies therein, that's a game changer for the industry overall. The difficult part about that, though, is the construction industry even now sits near the back of the pack in terms of digitization and IT spend. So it's at the bottom of the list in terms of percent of revenue spent on IT. And then when we look at the level of digitization in the construction industry, even now, it is near the bottom. It's only beat to the bottom by agriculture and hunting, for levels of digitization. And that's not to say that, there aren't lighthouses, for individual contractors that are, experimenting and doing some novel things individually. This is still looking on aggregate at the construction industry as a whole, right? Another bright spot from the survey that we mentioned around the COVID-19 crisis, you know, 60% of the respondents who said, hey, or of the respondents that said, listen, investments in technology and facilities are important, 60% of respondents to a follow-up survey said that they were actually investing money in technology and facilities. Similarly, 52% of those respondents said that they were actually putting their money where their mouth was, as it relates to investments in industrial grade supply chains for the business. So these are not just, lip service shifts that, everyone thinks is going to happen, but we're all waiting to dip our toe in the water to do. These are things that, players in the industry are actively investing in and shifting their businesses toward. So I'll pause here. Jaimie, I'd love to just kind of hear your thoughts and kind of talk through, your thoughts on what we just, talked through.
It's fascinating stuff. As you know, I get very excited about these topics. I'd be really interested to know. So this is so McKinsey did the productivity imperative document some time ago, and that was followed by Reinventing Construction, and this one that was preceded. Certainly in the UK, there's been endless reports saying exactly the same things we're now saying: low productivity, fragmented, lack of collaboration, things. So we've been saying this to ourselves for decades. I'm interested to know whether you're seeing any trends. I'm quite intrigued by that last slide saying that actually now people are properly investing in it. Whether you've seen more and more people saying, oh, we definitely need to change, we really need to change, and whether this is actually finally the tipping point where that's making a shift, whether it would have happened anyway, or whether, as you say, COVID's just accelerating a thing that almost had to happen, and whether you can see more people moving from talking about it to acting on it, or whether COVID's been a thing that sort of suddenly dramatically changed the landscape.
So I think the answer is both, right? COVID has very clearly shifted the landscape. The ways of working pre-COVID, in an era of social distancing and advanced public health requirements just will not work. And when you look at the way that, especially, general contractors, all businesses in general, take it for example, we're on a Zoom call right now presenting, this information. But when you look at how work is being done in the field, general contractors are, in addition to, labor shortages, in addition, to, some of the exogenous factors that, we were all aware of in the industry before the pandemic, are now having to, manage the public health implications on their sites. And that means they have to lean on technology to do things like collaboration. They have to lean more on technology to get more productivity with fewer FTEs on site. And by the way, ensure first and foremost that they're doing it in a safe manner. So it has been a significant forcing function. But to your point, the industry at large has said these things ad nauseum for several years. So the shift has been coming. We've all said, hey, these things need to happen, but this was the proverbial boot to the bottom that kicked us out of the plane.
Yeah. And if you got, I don't know whether you've got any, certainly the UK, one of the things that's troubling people, even before this, we had a skills gap and an aging demographic. So we know we're going to lose a lot of our skilled people over the coming years. My suspicion is, as you know, a load of people will not come back to construction post-COVID. I don't know whether that's a global trend and whether you're seeing that elsewhere, because we'd started looking at automation prior to this, primarily for that kind of productivity benefit, but it feels like automation is going to have to become part of this if you're talking about fewer people on sites, more social distance. That's a strand that isn't coming out yet in some of the technological shift, but feels like that's going to start coming to the fore in the next few years, maybe.
Yeah, I think it will. I can't speak for labor dynamics globally. I can say in the US, it's a larger, it's a larger surface area, but again, construction even in the US is hyper localized and fragmented, right? So you would not have a company that was super, deep in the New York City area, for example, bidding on a project in Idaho, for example, right? And so because of that geographic fragmentation, you will still have microcosms of the same dynamics in many places, right? I would say that the fear that you often run into, especially with craft labor, is when you talk about automation, they're talking about automating someone out of a job. But it's my personal opinion that if this is done correctly, right, this is done in concert with the unions, this is done in ways that boost safety. This is automation is taken into account in ways that augments and supplements the labor that is there. It's not something just based on the labor dynamics and the gap of skilled labor that we have in the industry that will just completely wipe out, a bunch of people from skilled and well-paying jobs, right?
Yeah, I mean, we've been the way we've been talking to people here about it is to say, look, if you look at the UN predicts 4.5 billion more people on the way. The amount of infrastructure, social and transport infrastructure we need to build in the next 30 years is vast.
Yeah.
Given that we have low productivity, low margins, things, we can't possibly build enough stuff. So actually, the problem isn't we're going to automate people out of the jobs. We haven't got enough people in the first place. We need this to enable us to actually do some of the things that need to happen over the next few years.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a sort of slightly false argument to say we're going to automate people out of jobs. Go, no, that's not the problem we're facing at the moment.
Well, I mean, it's a fair concern. I would not say, at least based on the information that all the trends and needs that we just discussed, that it's necessarily going to be an industry trend that just we're just automating people out of a job. I do not believe that that's going to be the case.
Yeah. There's some good questions in the comments, but I want to come back to them because I know you're going to cover some of the topics they've talked about in your slides. I had a couple of slides just before you go on to the next session, just to talk about some of the things that are happening in the UK, because it's really starting to put some meat, I suppose, on the bones of the things you've talked about. So I had the great pleasure, thank you, of talking to this group last year about the stuff that we were doing on construction platforms. So I'm not going to cover that. I'm just going to quickly give a bit of an update on where UK government's been. So for anyone who wasn't on the session last time, there's been a real concerted effort by the UK government over a few years now to really push industrialised construction. So it started back in 2017. Our effectively federal budget statement said, it didn't give much detail, but it said the government is going to use its combined spending power to drive modern methods of construction. And it didn't say what that meant. It just said, look, it was setting the kind of tone for we're going to get into something a bit more advanced. And that's been followed by a series of documents. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but over the last couple of years, particularly, this cluster of documents have come out, and they've all been incredibly consistent. They've all been very linked, and they've all been putting more and more detail around this topic of platforms. So this was the one that kind of where government first really articulated what it means by MMC. So we're using the term platforms, which was sort of deliberate because it has both a kind of software meaning, obviously, but also automotive and manufacturing use a common chassis across lots of different car types. So government's thinking was if we could start to, rather than focus on the differences between sectors, which is very common, if we could start to look for commonality the working assumption was you could probably identify common features that were similar across loads of different sectors, and therefore you could use common components across lots of sectors, and that gets you into the kind of economies of scale manufacturing likes, which is exactly aligned with the next normal, where it's talking about productization of buildings, industrialization. This is exactly where the kind of government's head's at. It's sort of seen this coming, and it's starting to say, how can I use my spending power to accelerate that? So just before Christmas, literally last couple of weeks in December, they published this document, which was a set of 14 policies, which basically set out how government is going to spend hundreds of billions of pounds over the next 5-10 years. It probably couldn't have happened without COVID, actually. This was a really very coordinated, concerted effort to get government and industry, designers, general contractors working together to kind of write this book that outlines how they're going to deliver this. And you probably couldn't have done it without the fact that everyone was available and everyone was on Zoom calls. But the speed with which government was able to put this together, I thought, was quite impressive. But it sets out some of these policies, and you can see two of the key things here. Harmonise, digitise, rationalise demands. This is saying we're going to start getting all of our cross-spend data into a form that we can then analyze it. So rather than think about projects or programs or even sectors, we're going to think about the government spend in its totality, do that consistently, do it very digitally, which will drive a lot of the things that were talked about in the next normal. And on the right hand side, you can see there, they're saying again, we'll use that then to define common platforms that will work across sectors, across programs, and that's how we're going to make this shift. So when you talked about consolidation, digitization, industrialization, productization, this is exactly what the UK government is leaning into now. And the last thing I'll show you, this then came out a week later. This was a piece of work we've been doing with the Construction Innovation Hub. So we basically took the pipeline data for all of the government departments across the next 5 years, put that into this consistent format, and then we could start to run lots of analysis and look for these commonalities. And we found things like less than half of any sector's spaces are really sector specific. So in a classroom, education spaces are less than half of it. A lot of it is circulation, waiting, storage, canteen, so not really kind of core functionality. Same in hospitals, same in prisons. So this is starting to say, well, actually, you could take massive chunks of the government estate and standardize it. So why have corridors designed individually every time? We could do something a bit smarter there. We found that, for instance, there's 104 different names for toilets across the government estate, and therefore probably thousands of different designs. So if we could rationalize those, you could start to get these kind of common components. So we're in the foothills of this, and there's going to be another report comes out this month. But yeah, it's demonstrating maybe all the things that you talked about in the next normal sort of coming to fruition. Government starting to use its spending power, big data, consolidating that, turning that into kits of parts and using that to drive everything else. And obviously this lends itself to a very industrialized approach. That's the point. It lends itself to a very digital approach. So yeah, we're obviously, UK have a particular view on this, but it's a really fascinating space to see actually that the entire government moving from talking about it, having heard the words that have been said in some of these reports, and saying, right, here's our approach, we'll start to drive maybe some different outcomes. So I think that's yeah, it's moving quite quickly in the UK, and hopefully there's something interesting there that kind of feeds into the next part of the conversation.
So now that the stage is set for where we think the construction industry is going, I think we can shift directly into construction technology industry and understanding within that context what's going on in the construction technology industry. So 4 major points, and this portion of the talk really focuses on our article, Rise of the Platform Era, the next chapter in construction technology. 4 major points from that article. First, the construction tech industry is growing rapidly. That growth has accelerated over the past decade. Second, construction tech includes a highly diverse set of use cases. Investment levels vary by use case. Third, the construction tech industry competitors are shifting towards platform plays. And these are technology platforms rather than, kind of integrated tech hardware platforms, like you mentioned, Jaimie. And then finally, there are still opportunities to create value both in what we call point solutions, and within platform plays. So looking at the rapid growth, and acceleration of that growth over the past decade, investment in construction tech has more than doubled, over the past decade. If you look at, 2009 to 2013, there was around $8 billion invested in construction tech. When you look at 2014 through 2019, it's around $25 billion invested in the same space. And then when you look at that $25 billion and break it out between 2014 and 2019, most of that money is in M&A, private equity, or some version of venture capital. So this isn't just, businesses swapping hands and, churn within the industry. This is net growth with PE dollars and early and late stage venture capital. When you look at venture capital investment in the construction tech space, and this isn't one for one in terms of dollar, but this is versus trajectory. So, indexed 100% to 2009, you could see that the yearly volume of venture capital deals in construction tech far outstrips the volume of analogous deals in venture capital, excluding construction technology. Now, that's not to say that the dollar figure outside of construction technology is smaller than construction tech. That's just to say that the volume of deals in construction tech far outstrips the growth of volume in overall VC. And then when you look at investment flows, those investment flows continue to grow, right? So the solid line that you see are exits, right? And there are a couple of major exits that happened in 2018 and 2016 that provide some chunky jumps. But the really interesting thing that I think about this chart is when you look at early stage VC, which is the black dotted line, that has a much more consistent growth curve that is continuing to spike. And over the observable period to 2009 to 2014, you see that growth is fairly flat. It's growing, but not significantly. And then when you look 14 through 19 and forward, you can see an appreciable jump in the amount of investment in early stage VC in construction tech, again pointing to a rapid expansion of the space with net new companies. Second point, because construction tech includes a highly diverse set of use cases, investment levels can vary by use case. And so we looked at around 2,400 construction technology firms and mapped their use cases against each other to understand what the ecosystem of construction technology looks like. And so this map, while confusing to some, is actually a map of the different technology use cases in construction tech based on those 2,400 firms. So what you see is the thickness of the lines represents the number of players offering connected use cases simultaneously. That would mean, Josh Co offers document management and, paper receipt scanning. That would mean that those two use cases have a thicker dark line between them. The circle size indicates the total number of players offering that use case. So if Josh Co and 50 other people are offering document management, the bubble is big. If only Josh Co is offering document management, that bubble starts to be small, right? And so when you look at the size of these bubbles and the thickness of their connectivity, you get to kind of start to see constellations emerge around the different technology use cases. And again, this is all in the article, so I won't belabor the point, but the point here around this page in this conversation is this is a rich ecosystem full of diverse use cases that are, somewhat centered around a few different constellations of actual applications. When we look at the investment flows, or rather the investment activity across these different things, it also paints an interesting story. And so we took the path of looking at this across the project lifecycle. So running from concept and feasibility through design and engineering, pre-con, construction and commissioning, ops and maintenance, and then some things that we would consider overarching that would touch all of those kind of life cycle tasks. And as I mentioned in my introduction, the construction and commissioning phase by far has the most heat, right? It has the largest number of companies with transactions, the largest number of transactions, etc. It is really where the construction technology industry focuses most of its attention, primarily, again, as I said, because the customer set for the construction technology industry tends to be general contractors, and the easiest value prop that you can offer a general contractor is, hey, GC, I'm going to come and I'm going to make your core competency more efficient. I'm going to help you deliver a project at 20% the cost and a quarter of the time, being hyperbolic, but that's effectively what they're saying, right? When you break out, however, that project phase into kind of like the use cases that sit within those project phases, you start to see some interesting nuggets. So, it comes as no surprise that when you look at design and engineering, engineering and design tools is a massive bucket of focus for the construction technology industry. Similarly, in concept and feasibility, capital strategy and portfolio optimization when it comes to owners managing their capital projects is a fairly large bucket with numbers of companies. But I think the interesting thing when you look at this is, in the lower right-hand corner of the page, there's that dark box. That box says that, in the past 5 years, artificial intelligence has the largest number of companies founded, right? And when you look at, the overarching technologies, enterprise resource planning has the largest median transaction amount across all of them. The biggest dollars were paid for ERP type softwares and applications, right? So there's this entire piece around connectivity being at a premium first, and then there's a second piece around like the next phase of growth within construction technology, leveraging data and advanced analytics or advanced artificial intelligence to drive the next field of step change of productivity. So the next kind of point that we make, construction tech industry competitors are shifting more towards platform plays, right? When you look at the construction technology ecosystem, there are a bunch of different players. As we said, we looked at 2,400 of them. And there are really two, modes of competition. Either you are, offering some type of bespoke point solution, right? And so you've got, a solution that very specifically, deals with, a phase of the project or a phase of execution, or you're offering some type of platform that encompasses an entire chunk of the project lifecycle, right? Both of those modes of competition are valid, and both of them have opportunities for growth. But it's very clear that there's this kind of bifurcation in competitive strategy in the market. And then when we look at these platform players, there are a couple of very clear observations. First, these platform competitors often launch with a focus on a specific phase, right? They either focus on engineering and design, they focus on field execution, or they focus on a subsegment. They're trying to be everything there possibly could be for, mechanical engineering and plumbing subcontractors, right? That gives them an advantage. If you're a first mover and you're able to get scale, then you become the platform of choice for that niche or that project phase. But what it also means is, while those trends are growing for the rapid growth of platforms, the prospect of a single winner is pretty low, partially because these platform players focus and grow in a specific project phase. If they're going to start in a specific project phase, which they do, and grow and get to scale in that specific project phase, which they do, then the only way to grow outside of that, once you get to scale in your project phase, is to enter, or your area of strength is to enter an area of strength where there is already another platform or incumbent that is already scaled and grown, and you've got a huge learning curve to compete with them by building something yourself. The easier, more effective way, and quite honestly, the more palatable way for construction technology clients is just to have many platforms that are interoperable, or at least talk to each other in a seamless way, so that the user experience for someone using these technology tools is seamless, rather than trying to be the end all be all for the entire construction industry. Again, you're talking about $13 trillion in global spend. The pool is too wide and the water too deep for just one player to be the platform for all of it, in our opinion. You would do too many things not good enough to be competitive with many of the focused solutions that are out there. And then finally, there are still opportunities to create value across both, platforms and point solutions. So when you look at point solutions, the ways to generate, growth and value are first capitalizing on the continued growth and penetration of mature solutions. We in construction technology like to think of building information models, BIM, as a mature technology. But when you look at like how BIM is actually used in practice, and what the level of penetration it is in the industry, we're still just scratching the surface with the capabilities of that type of technology and like utilizing it to its fullest extent. So there's still a case to be made for just capitalizing on the continued growth and penetration capability of what we would consider mature solutions. Secondly, and this kind of touches on this piece around automation that we just discussed, also on this growth in artificial intelligence. Scaling early major disruptive solutions such as robotics could drive a significant, or even 3D additive manufacturing could drive significant value for either a strategic or a technology player with a distinctive point solution. There's another piece which is hugely important and not as sexy, which is scaling the underlying technology infrastructure that's going to enable the use of all of these artificial intelligence startups that we just discussed growing over the last 5 years. Without a clear data layer and infrastructure layer to actually capture all of the IoT sensors, talk to all of the different pieces of equipment in the build environment, organize all of that data in one common way, in one common hierarchy, and then communicate it to the disparate numbers of software and hardware solutions that need to analyze it and use it, and then, by the way, convert it to some type of output that makes business decisions capable. We're not going to be able to really see the benefit of a lot of the technology applications and solutions that we see out there. So scaling that underlying tech infrastructure is hugely important. And finally, but certainly not least, digitizing payments, right? Like the acceleration and the speed of commerce and construction has to go up, right? There are still, in many places, construction companies and players that still use paper invoices and paper, receipt tickets to receive materials on site. And it takes, several days. There are some with net 75 payment, I think, is the average, payment term in the construction industry overall, right? That has to get sped up. And that's only going to get sped up in earnest if we digitize payments way, way deeper in the supply chain, not just bulk purchases, but down to payments for subcontractors, payments for bulk materials or discrete materials on site once they're received, digital recognition of receipt on site, things that are hardcore supply chain things. Again, to tie it back to our observations in the new normal, digitizing and growth of extended supply chains, right? And then when we think about platform solutions, there are many household names for platforms. I won't mention them, but I'm sure anyone who is available and has followed the space can think of 3 or 4 names off the bat that have technology platforms. If a player, either a strategic player or a technology company or an investor looking at a platform, they want to start scaling platforms with a specific angle. Like I said, most of the platforms that grow not out of just like, spreading a layer across the entire, life cycle of a project. They grow with a specific angle. And there are still potential white spaces out there for platforms with a specific angle if you have a distinctive value proposition. The second thing is leveraging these platforms that exist or that are on the next wave of platforms coming up to develop solutions that enable broader connection in the built environment, right? And this is kind of a symbiotic relationship with what we talked about earlier around needing to invest in the infrastructure to do this. But if a platform is suddenly able to connect to all of the IoT sensors, not just on equipment, but also on people, leverage that information to dynamically and automatically update, a building information model. That building information model is able to then drive, dashboards and KPIs that give you much more real-time information onto the health and progress of a project, to say nothing of a portfolio of projects. That becomes incredibly powerful for both owners and construction leaders to manage their projects more effectively. And then finally, and this is something that's kind of going on in the background to begin with, but investing much more in building a data analytics engine for platforms, right? It's not enough to just be able to manage things and see the data up front. On a platform. Platforms need to begin, and I think that they are, but much more so, begin to invest in advanced data analytics that leverage the huge lakes of data that they have to drive some value for their customers. So that's the entirety of the content that I have to share. Jaimie, would love to just hear your thoughts on what we had, and also field a few of these questions from the participants.
Yeah, there's some really good questions actually, so I want to get onto those. But yeah, I've got a couple of things I want to ask first. Can you go back to the constellation diagram that showed all the different the lines between the different types of work? Because we're interested to unpack or understand a bit more about what's in some of those boxes. So this one, yeah, so it really surprised me. Digital twins is not linked, or it's linked via number 28, which is 3D printing, which seems a bit weird in artificial intelligence. I would have expected digital twins and AI would be, butting up to each other or talking to each other. So can you unpack a bit about what's in that? You mentioned this, it's one of the growing topics, AI, what's in that box and what's in the digital twins box, and why aren't they talking to each other?
Inspection. I'm just looking to make sure that I'm very clear on the specific ones that are in there. And 21 is laser scanning. Yes. So digital twins. And then you said you were asking why 3D printing doesn't butt up against it.
No. So you've then got artificial intelligence. There's that down the bottom. You've got something with deep learning. 22 is machine learning. Number 8 is, I can't find it now, predictive assessment performance. So those are the sort of things I would expect to be talking to digital twins and smart assets, but they don't. They talk via 3D printing. It's a bit strange. So I wonder if you've got a view on. They're obviously nascent things. It's quite early days, but what's in those boxes? AI we talked a bit about. So what's in that, and why is it not linked to digital twins in a much more sort of realistic way?
Yeah. So when we did this, again, these were use cases that were connected. And so the simple answer is, in the subset of companies, 2,400 firms is not the entire, population of construction technology firms, but in the population of firms that we analyzed, those use cases were not directly connected, is the long and short of it. When you look at digital twins, our view and our research showed that those were much more geared towards simulation analyses and such, whereas AI and analytics applications were not directly connected to them in terms of use cases. So that was just our observation, kind of looking at the data that we had in front of us.
So over time, you'd expect, if you did this in 5-10 years, firstly, my guess is there'd be a lot more dots. There'd be some much bigger dots, and there'd be a lot more interconnectivity. I think people are just sort of picking a topic at the moment and trying things. It's not joined up as a kind of complete digital ecosystem, as you say, for all the reasons we talked about.
And that is kind of the story behind the rise of these platforms, right? When you think about the construction technology industry, and its growth, it started with several players offering these point solutions, and some of them were digital twins, some of them are AI applications, some of it were office applications, etc. And you grew with all of these different firms offering these different use cases. What platforms are now doing is kind of starting to homogenize many of these use cases into one space. And so at this point, at least at the scale that would show up on some kind of mapping like this, I'm sure that there's some companies out there that are doing it individually, but at a scale that would show up at a mapping like this, no, we have not seen that convergence yet. But that's not to say that, to your point, in 5 to 10 years, that this just not, these bubbles don't shift, the bubbles change names, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. And Ray's asked a question in the chat, why is 34 on its own? Not 34 is offsite fabrication. He's right, actually. I'd expect it to be linked into a whole load of these newer bubbles and optimization of labor resource, et cetera. I'm surprised it's quite a small bubble, actually, given everything else that's happening in the industry. Do you know why that is?
So 34, I see, in the constellation for 3D printing, modularization, and robotics. You know, the short answer is that is kind of how it played out in the data that we had. Again, I think when we look at 34 as offsite manufacturing, you know, that was more focused on, you know, volumetric and panelized modular than it was on a specific technology application. And so that could be a potential driver for why it is not directly connected to others. But at least thematically, it is still connected to those other kind of use cases. These connectivity pieces, you know, it's an imperfect analysis, but still, we think insightful for how the industry is kind of evolving based on the use cases and that are prevalent in the industry.
Yeah. And can you skip on the detailed one that had all the investment and numbers of companies and things? There's a couple of things on that I thought were quite interesting.
Yep.
So one of the things that I was particularly intrigued by was, and is it Jill's asked a question about the operation of facilities. So it amazes me that there's not a lot more happening in the O&M, facility management and improvement, because that's where a lot of the value is won or lost. And similarly, at the very front end of the project. So yeah, the people are not investing at the front end and the back end, which is where huge amounts of value are created or lost. And I sort of know why that is, but maybe you can expand on that a bit, because I thought that was quite an interesting topic.
Yeah. So I would say I would caution first by saying they're not, because this is the entire industry overall is growing and growing rapidly, right? Full stop, right? The second piece is that growth is unevenly distributed, right? So, you know, looking at this by just saying lowest to highest without taking that caveat to say, like, this is a you know, I guess to put my engineer hat on, this is, you know, the first derivative of it, right? Like, all of it's moving at a high speed, but if we take that first derivative and look at what is the relative acceleration of all of it, right? It is what I would look at this representing. With that being said, I think it points to the same kind of theme that I talked about earlier, which is construction technology firms, by and large, you know, pitch to and serve, you know, contractors. And unless that contractor is a full EPC, which many are, but, you know, unless they are, they're often most focused on the construction and commissioning phase. Operations and maintenance generally falls within the purview of the owner. And that's kind of that while it's important, I completely agree. Doesn't, you know, at least according to our analyses, you really get covered to the degree, you know, that it should, if you were looking at a total cost of ownership perspective, by the construction technology industry. Similarly, you know, we all know the ubiquitous names for engineering and design tools, you know, up front, but and so that's there, and those players all have their different value props. But what is less, you know, likely and less available is this kind of portfolio optimization and treating you know, tools and technologies that are focused on treating, you know, entire portfolios of projects from an owner's perspective, like, you know, for lack of a better term, an investment portfolio, right? And optimizing the return on capital of those projects, you know, by, you know, homogenizing the way that the projects are scoped and scheduled, scrubbing the projects to make sure that, you know, gold plating isn't in there, you know, et cetera, those types of technology solutions, again, because the construction tech industry, you know, heavily focuses on contractors, and that function generally falls into the purview of the owner, you know, are not as high.
Yeah. So I've got loads of my own questions, but I won't ask those because there's some really good ones in the chat. Steve Burrows asked, and this is a fantastic question, how do you see the financial model changing to support the technological changes? So just to broaden that, I mean, we've seen one of the barriers to building information modeling in the UK was nothing really to do with the technology. It was about the procurement and the financial incentives and the handover of information. So technology can't exist without sometimes procurement rules and some of that kind of wider ecosystem and IP and things catching up with it. I don't know if you've got a view on what else needs to change to facilitate this, because it won't necessarily be the tech by itself. The kind of ecosystem that surrounds it also needs to facilitate some form of change.
Mhm. I think a lot of the work that you presented on, in kind of like the intermezzo from our talk is important, right? Like the regulatory environment obviously has to be there. Also, the ownership push has to be there, right? Like many of the applications that we look at here are, again, geared toward and marketed to the contractor to serve the owner. But if a owner at scale, maybe the UK government, mandated and said like BIM will be the thing, you are going to use it. And here's the timeline that you have to use it, or you're not going to be eligible for this X trillion dollars worth of spend. Then the industry starts to pay attention and they start to make a way to be able for that to work, right? So I think that just a concerted push from owners in aggregate would do a great deal of good for the adoption of those types of technologies. I also think that specifically with BIM, there's another layer of kind of standardization of design that you touched on, and also standardization of these tools, right? Like if you look at BIM objects, for example, those are extremely flexible and allow you to put together a design very quickly. But there are all types of BIM objects out there that are custom BIM objects. They're home cooked BIM objects that different architects and engineering firms will have. NBS has its own library of BIM objects, right? Like the more that you're able to standardize some of these things, the better and easier it will be to adopt.
Yeah. The other part of that, Steve's asked a follow-up question. What we're grappling with in our world at the moment is the original idea was this sort of continuous digital loop from operational data, front end, asset planning things. But there's quite a few breaks. So when we go into our regulatory submissions, it's 2D PDFs. You stop, print them out, hand them over. There's quite a few bits in that which is still very manual and not machine readable, and we're seeing places like Singapore are starting to automate things like their planning and statutory regulations. Do you think that's another sort of precursor or a thing that has to keep up, is then the kind of statutory piece has to enable it? Otherwise some of these technologies just don't work because they can't really hand over the data in quite the way you'd like them to.
No, I agree. And I think, more broadly speaking, when you think about construction, the construction industry as a whole, like if you think about the contractors that are, hip to construction technology, you don't become a super regional or global contractor without being aware of and leveraging, to the degree that the rest of the industry is leveraging at minimum, some type of technology. Where technology adoption starts to fall off fairly rapidly are, Jaimie's plumbing service, Josh's mechanical works, Margie's electrical contractors, right? Like the small, tier 2, tier 3 contractors that, are hyper regional, hyper local. Maybe it's 2 people in a van, but, they don't have any connectivity to these things. And there aren't very many, solutions at scale that they can use to manage their businesses and do so in a way that connects to these bigger global contractors. So eventually, contractors at the scale of a global contractor are much more risk managers than they are actually self-performing the vast majority of the work. It's going to eventually trickle down through their systems to a point where you're interfacing with these much smaller companies. And if they don't have a way to participate in this kind of digital ecosystem in a meaningful way, then it just becomes, that's where the disconnect comes. And that's like a feature of the industry overall globally, right?
But it's going to come down, and I guess it'll come down to sort of apps on your phone. We're already seeing that. I've seen a few versions of this where people doing individual trades, plumbers, painters and things, have an app on their phone and it has a certain schedule of work, and they just fill that in, and the only they see just a tiny tip of the data that they need to do their job, fill in the app, and it sends it back, and all that gets aggregated. So I was always nervy about how the kind of long tail of the supply chain would engage in this, and then you start seeing everyone's got a digital device, everyone's got access to this. Everyone knows how to do this in their personal lives. So maybe that's a way of starting to engage those sort of longer tail people, rather than say the answer is just massive consolidation and there's 3 or 4 massive contractors out there.
Yeah, I think like we said earlier, from a industry dynamic standpoint, we are pretty confident in our assessment that, maybe not tomorrow, but certainly, in the next 5 to 10 years, there will be, consolidation of the value chain and consolidation of each span and layer. But I agree in the sense that, when you talk about tech enablement and adoption of technology, these are things that we do in our day-to-day life. I don't think there's anyone, that is a working professional today that does not have a smartphone or does not know how to use, the apps on their phone. It's much more about integrating that capability and finding ways and solutions that allow us to integrate those core competencies into our work in the construction industry.
Yeah. Margie, I just want to check. It's well 5 o'clock here. It's obviously earlier there. I don't know whether you wanted to stop on the air or whether we should just keep chatting, because there's still quite a few questions in the chat that will be interesting.
I definitely think you should keep chatting. If you want to grab a beer, that's fine too. Happy hour time for you, but we're still on our coffee here in San Francisco. But please continue. I think we'll see some drop off. Usually these webinars are only 60 minutes, but because I think the content is so rich and certainly the conversation is, let's continue.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, Alice has asked a question: who in the industry or adjacent might be best positioned to help set the data structure required? Which again, it's another massive hot topic, actually trying to, we've seen some steps in this direction of the software starting to talk to it. Other providers starting to become a bit more interoperable, but really it needs a kind of robust data standards. And is that something the industry needs to do itself? Does it need to be imposed on them? Who might do it? It's a massive topic, because if you had that sorted, a lot of this stuff flows naturally, right? But it's a bit of a question who puts in the effort and how you start to shape that. And you've got a view on that?
Yep. Personal opinion here, but I would say that the folks doing the work are generally the best folks to kind of define the work. It's the industrial engineer in me, the go to the shop floor and see ethos. And so my answer would be, it's probably best positioned for an industry regulator, not a regulator, but an industry, body, a trade association, et cetera, in the same way that the IEEE, in the US provides, work standards, or the IBEW for electricians provides training and standardization for work practices, that an industry association would do so for technology, specifically related to construction. Because otherwise you have a disconnect where, there are bodies and leaders offering structure and regulation and definition around concepts that they are not directly exposed to. And that provides a disconnect that would do, in my opinion, more harm than good. So I think that the industry itself, some type of, trade association or certification body or something like that would be the best position to do that, rather than, some outside body.
Yeah, it's something we've been grappling with for a long time and haven't solved yet. So if you work out how to do it, let us know. I'm quite interested to talk about. So everything you've got so far has been, all the data you've got has been predicated on the kind of current setup. Mm-hmm. Or the current industry. Obviously, we talked a little bit before about if you expect the 9 shifts that are set out in the next normal really take hold, actually there's more and more white space. That ecosystem starts to expand. I mean, the opportunity, the 25 billion seems like it could be a fraction of the amount of money that's actually going to pour into construction in the coming decades. Yeah. Where do you think, or it's obviously too soon to say, but maybe you can talk a bit about sort of where you think this might go. I've got a particular fascination with this, that it feels like tech don't really want to invest in construction because we're bonkers for all the reasons that you talked about in the early things. But you can imagine a sort of virtuous circle. We get a bit more sophisticated, we become a bit more sensible. Tech goes, oh, it's a good place to invest, we get better. And you can imagine a exponential increase if we decide to push in that direction. So maybe you can talk a bit about that opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's fair. All of the use cases, in our analyses were existing use cases, or nascent use cases that at minimum, had some type of, institutional backing. There was some player out there offering it, right? Or some collection of players out there offering it, right? We expect that the construction technology industry will grow, that it will continue to grow rather briskly, and that that growth will accelerate. With in no small part driven by the global pandemic, right? Like the cat's out of the bag in terms of contractors using technology in ways that they had not used them previously, or not just contractors, but businesses overall, and players across the construction ecosystem. So first and foremost, we expect that the construction technology industry will grow, and will grow rather rapidly, and that the acceleration will pick up. The acceleration of that growth rather will pick up. To your point around the size of the industry now versus 5-10 years from now, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't have a number. And if I gave you a number, it would be a wild, it would be a wild swag.
Yeah.
But I can tell you that, if a $13 trillion global industry, spent, on aggregate, collectively, 2 to 3% of their spend just on technology, that alone, shows an absolutely massive growth potential for technology, right? If it's 2 to 3% of the global spend on construction was in these pieces of technology, that is a massive, 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 massive industry. So I think that the growth prospect is certainly there. The thesis is certainly there. I think it comes down to, at least in this case, either owners mandating the adoption of these solutions and really pushing for it from that end, regulators mandating the adoption of these solutions or pushing for it from that end, because either the costs or the outcomes are unsustainable from a financial or a social lens, or it comes from a couple of general contractors just saying, what, we manage risk, but we view it as more of an existential risk not to do this than to continue with the status quo. We're going to embrace a fail fast mindset, and we're going to just do it.
Yeah, it's my desperate hope that someone from within the construction industry does this properly, because when you talk about those sorts of numbers, it always raises a spectre of disruption that every other major industry has been tipped on its head by someone else coming in and going, oh, I could do that in a different way, not coming with the old baggage. And you go, the more data rich we become, the more sort of technology centric we become, the more we become adjacent to those industries where someone else might look and go, oh, actually now you've sort of created a space. I don't think it will be Amazon, but the contractor of the future in the UK often gets described as being as very good at data, good at procurement, good at supply chain. And yeah, just like Amazon, I don't think it will be them, but it feels like if contractors or someone doesn't make the first move and decide to disrupt ourselves, it will be imposed on us within 5-10 years, because the opportunity is so vast. Someone else is going to start looking at this and going,
yeah. And I mean, I wouldn't just like frame it as Amazon. I mean, the contractor of the future looks like an integrated manufacturer, right? And the contractor of the future in that model of integrated manufacturing is not just native to online retailing, right? Like there are a bunch of companies out there that are capable of doing integrated manufacturing. I think that when you look at the disruption potential, though, it is real. And the headwinds that we discussed at the very beginning of this talk when we talked about trends in the construction industry are very real, right? Like it is forgive me for misquoting, but it's something like 60% of major projects over $500 million are over schedule, and 70% of them are over budget at some level, right? At the level of money being spent and burnt by doing things with the status quo, it just is unsustainable. It just, especially given, to your point around our conversation around automation, the backlog of work that will need to be done to satisfy the demand that's coming in the next couple of decades, right? Like it is just fundamentally unsustainable. So, the disruption is coming. Either the players in the industry are going to be the ones to disrupt themselves, or someone else, some other player from some other industry, or just a brand new player within the industry is going to figure out how to do it, and they're going to shift the value pool disproportionately in their favor.
Yeah. There's a couple of questions on the chat. Patrick's asked, what are the biggest obstacles preventing these changes? I've got a view on this, but it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on this.
So I think the one big obstacle, we talked about a few of them. Some of it is the ubiquitousness of the drilling the tech adoption down to your tier 2, tier 3 subcontractors, your individual mom and pops. I think that there are difficulties with standardization across construction just to begin with, and when you don't have things standardized, it makes adoption of technology much more difficult, because things then need to be bespoke solutions for a common problem. But honestly, I think that especially since construction technology is, again, focused on the general contractor, that it really comes down to general contractors actually jumping in with both feet, right? Like general contractors, Jaimie, you and I had this conversation, I think a couple of days ago, or was it yesterday during our prep, that, a big super regional or a multinational general contractor in many cases is no longer a contractor in the purest sense of the word. They are a risk manager, right? And they still will likely have pieces of jobs that they self-perform, but they will much more disproportionately be subcontracting out a lot of that execution to, local or regional players who are actually doing the execution and carrying that risk. And when you have a dynamic where the players in the industry who are best positioned to actually adopt things at the largest scale are also most incentivized to minimize and manage risk, and adopting these things by definition means taking on risk, then that's a really difficult environment for the industry to adopt technology. And like they're going to have to take risks all the way down to changing the incentive structure for how projects are managed. Because if you can't hang your PM on a branch and say, hey Jaimie, I get that you're running this $500 million job that's going to make or break your career, but we're going to do something brand new on your job that you've never done before, that no one's ever done before, and it might fail, but it's all right because this is your job and we believe in you. And by the way, you're going to be judged exactly the same way. Good luck, right? Like, no one's going to do that, right? And so, those types of impediments, those kind of organizational mindset and behavior challenges are just as big in my mind, if not bigger, than the technological ones. The tech ones, in earnest, I think the technology exists in some way, shape, or form to do all of the things that we think are cool in construction, right? It's been done in some other venue, whether that be, consumer electronics or auto or aerospace or, electronics or drug manufacturing. Like the stuff exists. It really comes down to now us being able to say, we're going to swallow a couple of losses in some way, shape, or form. And we're going to learn how to operate in that fail fast mentality with the understanding that the long-term benefit of it is much higher than the short-term loss that we would get.
Yeah.
And we've got to manage our people that way and everything.
Yeah, that completely reflects our experience. I mean, we've been doing this for a long time, and yeah, the technology is none of the questions we get faced with are necessarily to do with the technology or the design or any of that stuff. It's all about insurance, IP, warranties, incentives, procurement. It's all those things. It's all that kind of ecosystem. It's why, some of the very early conversations we had with the UK government about this, they were saying, why do we have to step in? Because 9 times out of 10, the market sorts itself out. And we were saying, how's construction been doing for the last couple of thousand years? You are the only time this has ever worked is where companies like GlaxoSmithKline or Heathrow have stepped in and said, no, this is what we're doing. The only way you're going to work on this project is to work in this way. And I think government had seen a few false starts where it hadn't worked because of that risk averse mindset of the contractors going, I could do a new thing and try and transform the industry, or I could just get my normal supply chain and maybe we'll do it next time. So yeah, it kind of prompted the government to go, look, if we're going to do this, we are going to have to step into this space. And I really don't want to have to, but it takes someone of that sort of standing to kind of cut across some of those resistance and absolve them of some of the pain and go, it's fine, we're going to do this together, it's going to be good, we're not going to hold your hand, but it needs the client there on the other side to be pushing it. Otherwise, contractors don't generally feel, certainly the UK aren't feeling the need to just do this of their own volition. Or they're saying, I've only got 5% better than the competition, I don't need to be 50% better. I don't need to make a step change on this. I need to be a little bit better than the competition yet, which it's been painful. The other question Patrick asked, actually, which I don't know whether you've got a view on, from a sort of McKinsey, having looked around the world at this, who will lead the change in what market, where in the world, and why will it happen? So, I mean, we're seeing, Singapore, this is a really hot topic. Asia's doing a lot of work on this. Obviously, UK is adopting it. You guys are doing it. I don't know whether you've got a view of where people are relative to each other, where it's likely to break first. In my head, it feels like if someone does it, there'll be a whole load of fast followers almost around the world going, yes, good. No one wants to be the first person, but if it had been done, it would very, very quickly happen. So I don't know if you've got a view on where the dam's likely to break first or not.
Honestly, I don't. I think that there are, like I said at the beginning of our talk, there are kind of lighthouses throughout the industry globally for individual players in individual geographies doing some things, but at the level and speed of adoption that the global construction industry needs to really make a change. I don't think that there is one place where it's just going to suddenly shift and break. Now, that's my opinion. I very well could be wrong, but I think that there are enough changes that need to be made where the risk appetite needs to shift, right? Like the risk equation needs to shift, and whether that shift is because the owner operator has assumed some of that risk and absolved the contractor from it, whether as you've discussed extensively, the government steps in and incentivizes it through regulation. The current risk math that GCs do globally doesn't lend itself very well to rapid adoption. Now, COVID changed that because it immediately shifted that risk. It's saying, all right, well, you can do it or you cannot do business. Okay, well, it changes your risk profile, right? But in order for it to continue, there needs to be much more deliberate and intentional shifts to the risk math, or else things will go. We picked up Zoom calls and we're using that, and there that is, and like it'll just kind of stop when hopefully the pandemic becomes much more under control.
Yeah, it was interesting here. So things like we had a furlough scheme website that got established by the government. In normal times, that would have been like a 5-year IT project, and it happened in 3 months, 2 months. Actually, it was up live taking applications again. So yeah, what we've been watching with interest is our government saying to itself, oh, we're quite good, or we can be quite good under the right circumstances. It's like when someone takes the brakes off and changes the rules, actually things happen incredibly quickly. The construction playbook, as I said, wouldn't have happened, or it would have been a sort of 3-4 year engagement, and it happened within kind of 9 months because government, well, we've got everyone's in the same boat. Let's crack on and do this. So yeah, I'm intrigued to sort of see how much of this kind of new way of working really is sticky, and we persist with coming out the other side of it and actually go, yeah, I don't need to travel to the office every day. I don't, I have adopted all these new technologies. It'd be interesting to see how much of this is real change that happens, and how much of it people have got, quite short-term memories. Yeah, I don't know whether it's obviously wild speculation, but what do you think the industry could look like in 5 years' time if we really lent into this? It could be a fundamentally different place.
Oh yeah, I mean,
that will really happen, or whether people will go, oh, right, pandemic's over, back to basics.
I mean, were I a futurist and were to say, if everything went right, like I'm not going to say this is happening. I'm saying if everything went the way that we're discussing, what would happen? I think that you would have a much higher speed of commerce. You would have digitized payments, you would have digitized information flows, you would have a lot fewer the projects would cost less, and not just like the straight capex cost. You would also have a few lower opex costs and lower financing costs, because if you're moving information, particularly in the design and engineering phase, much more seamlessly with fewer errors, then your insurance underwriting is lower. The risk profiles on your financing are lower. The amount of margin that you need to make as a GC, that math changes all of a sudden, because you're able to produce much more efficiently with the same amount of or fewer resources than you had to previously. And again, like I said, I don't think that any of this stuff is net new in terms of technology, right? Like it exists somewhere. It certainly needs to be adopted and tailored to the construction industry, we'll say. But these things exist, and if they were adopted wholesale, if the platform was burning hot enough, right? Like if we were hurtling towards the sun at a high enough rate of speed, as evidenced by how the industry shifted overnight, due to the pandemic, we could do it, right? It's just getting the appropriate motivation to do so.
Yes, I remember when BIM first started becoming a thing, there was this talk about lonely BIM, saying there's certain things you can do in isolation. So as an organization, there's a designer say we could do certain things, create integrated models, but it wasn't a proper BIM workflow, because until the supply chain are also doing it and the clients also doing it, it's a sort of pots. I don't know if there's an answer to this, but there's obviously certain things contractors could do now themselves in isolation. There's certain bits of that ecosystem they can't do in isolation because it needs the rest of the industry doing them. But it does feel like there's a massive opportunity for the contractors who want to get into this to start working out how much that can I start to push now, how quickly can I advance myself and make myself almost like HD ready for the rest of the market, the rest of the ecosystem to catch up. So it feels like if you were so minded, a massive opportunity to get advance yourself ahead of the competition in a thing that's clearly going to happen at some point anyway.
Yep, I would agree.
Perfect. Just looking at the time, and we're losing people. I don't know whether, Margie, that's a good point to draw things to a close.
I think we might be ready. Thank you both so very much. This has been such a fantastic conversation. Jaimie, your comments on the role of government just couldn't be more timely for us in the United States as we anticipate a new president soon. So we'll take them to heart, see what we can do about it. Josh, you are amazing. We are so grateful for the analysis, the thoughtfulness, and the forecasting. So we'll bring you all back in a month maybe and see how much progress we've made on this. How's that sound?
Sure.
Anyway, I'd really like to thank all of you and all of our participants. We've recorded this session and placed it, and we'll be placing it on the CIDCI website as soon as possible. To join us for future webinars, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter on our website. And special thanks to Monica Zwisler for keeping us on track. And thank you both again for an amazing presentation. Be well.
Have a great one. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having us back. And yeah, great to see you again, Josh. That was really interesting. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank
Bye-bye
you
all.
so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.